A Soldier's Home is a story written by Ernest Hemingway. It was written in 1925. Um, it's set up about a soldier named Krebs. It's happening in a small town in Oklahoma. Um, there's a lot of activity. It's midsummer, so people are milling about. He likes to play pool. Pool halls are full. Um, the girls and people are milling about in the streets. There's just a lot of activity, so you can tell it's summer. And it's kind of interesting that he had come home a couple of years late from the war. So a lot of soldiers, they'd already come home. They'd had the parades. They'd had their welcoming mats laid out. The bands had been playing. All that stuff had already happened, and the town was done with that. They had moved on from the end of the war, and they'd moved on to a regular life. So him coming home now he was dealing with um, the war, and then trying to come home and not feeling accepted because the town really wasn't going out of their way to pull him in. So he would go tell stories, and the town had heard all these stories before. They had been hearing the war stories and clapping about them and laughing and holding their heroes up. And then he comes in telling stories, and they'd already heard them all before, so they weren't really interested. So he learned to embellish his stories a little bit so that he could be heard, so that he could get some of that, what he felt was a little bit of recognition for coming back. So it's kind of interesting how he does that. Um, another interesting thing I think that the writer doesn't get to this because the writer had been in war himself, so he understood what it was like to come home. He understood the struggles and the emotional stresses that were going on. But today, when a soldier comes home, PTSD is a known issue. So back then, it really wasn't. They would just see him as having a problem, and they would want him to deal with it, and they don't see it as a problem that is a problem because of the war. So, and now it's a lot more recognized. People get the help they need. They're able to go do that. And back then, they weren't able to do that. And that's kind of really interesting about the setting. And it's something that doesn't come out, and it wouldn't come out until recent years. And that's why I think this story is one that will kind of hang around for a long time, because unfortunately there's always going to be wars, and people are going to have to come home from that, and the stressors are all the same for everybody that comes home for the most part. I mean, everybody's got their own inner issues, but the stressors are there, and this story deals with those stresses and how society has to recognize that. It doesn't say that in here, but it's kind of one of those things that needs to happen. So you can see when this guy comes home, his family doesn't want to deal with him. They just want him to get better. Here, take my crispy. Dad tells him to take his car keys and sends him out. They just want him to go get a girlfriend, go get a job, just get back to yourself and make it happen. And there's very little understanding back then that that's just not the way things worked. I think the writer tried to convey that a little bit. He knows what it was like, so he tried to say, hey, look, this is something that Krebs can't deal with completely by himself. He's going to need some kind of help to get through it. And I think the writer does a pretty good job of making people understand that. And I think that's kind of the theme of this story, is that soldiers that are coming home have their own problems that they need to deal with. And they need to find a way to deal with them. And society just can't brush them off the side. They need to find a way to let the people deal with those problems. I think some other interesting things about the story. He wasn't interested in the girls at home, but he was still thinking about the girls back in Germany. And I do not think it had anything to do with they were prettier. In fact, the book is very adamant that the girls back in Germany weren't pretty, but they were simple. They weren't emotional relationships. He didn't have to talk about the things that he was going through with them. He just had a relationship, whether it be friendly, and they sat around and talked about other stuff, and it was simple stuff. And now he comes home and he realizes that if he has relationships with girls, that he's going to have to deal with them on an emotional level, and he doesn't want to do that. So I think that part's pretty interesting in this story. So There's a lot going on here. It's a good story worth reading, and there's a lot of meaning in there about how to deal with your struggles when you do come home. Life's not going to be that simple anymore, and he needs to find his way, and society needs to help him out. His family needs to help him out, and they don't need to do it in a way that isolates him. So they're just going to have to find a way to help him. So very interesting, and I think that it's definitely one that I'll pick up and read again.